Hey everyone, I'm Marcus and I'm the Sound Design and Innovation Manager here at ROLI. Airwave launched with 160 bespoke sounds, all built in our powerful Equator2 engine. And now for the first time, you'll be able to edit and create your own sounds because we've now included the full Equator2 editor within ROLI Airwave Player. In this video, I'll give you a bit of a tour of Equator2 and some of the new Airwave specific features and create a patch so you can get some ideas on how you can start making your own sounds. This isn't meant to be a full Equator2 walkthrough, there's too much to cover there, but we've got lots of other content available that goes deeper into some of Equator2's features. So let's start off with a little bit of a tour of the UI. When you first load up ROLI Airwave Player, you'll see the visualizer view, where I can see my hands, the keyboard, and the dimension that I'm controlling. I can click this panel on the left here to browse through different presets, but what you'll see now is that we have this edit button next to play at the top. If I click this, then the full Equator2 interface will open within ROLI Airwave Player. I'm just going to click New and then MPE to open a new template for creating a sound. Now the UI may look a little confusing at first, but let me try and take you through it simply. So the first thing to note is these 6 slots here, and these are our sound sources. Each sound can be made up of 6 independent sound sources. In these sound sources, we can select between different modes. So we have wavetable mode for those classic synthesized sounds. We have sampler mode, which covers both sampled analog synths, but also acoustic instruments like strings, guitars, etc. Then there's the granular mode, which breaks down samples into grains and allows you to manipulate them to achieve some really experimental results. And then finally, we have noise mode. Below the sound sources, we have our filters. So you can kind of think about all of this audio as then feeding down into the filter section. And that allows you to kind of sculpt, take out different frequencies to create new sounds from the source material. At the bottom here, we have lots of different modulation options. So there's the envelopes here, the LFO section, the multi-mod, the math modules, and then perhaps the most important, the dimension curves here. So we have 2 pages. The keyboard section here is for all of the dimensions that come from our keyboard. So that's our velocity, our pressure, and then we have all of our air dimensions as well. So air raise, air glide, all of these can be assigned and controlled here. Next, I'm going to go into the routing tab. This just allows me to route the audio from different sources to different places. So for example, with source 1, I could choose to send it into the filter before then going to effects, or I could take it out of the filter and send it straight into the effects. Finally, we have the effects page. There's up to 12 slots for 12 simultaneous audio effects. These can be either routed in series so that they all go through one after each other, or in parallel, which gives you 2 different effects chains for different assignments. So let's start creating a patch together now. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go into my first sound source here, and I'm going to select wavetable mode for a kind of synthesized texture as my kind of base to build upon. So the default waveform is this digital one, which will morph from a sine to a saw and a square, but we have hundreds of wavetables available that cover lots of different timbres. Let's take a listen to how that sounds by default. So to start, we've got this really simple sine wave. What I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the wavetable position here to get more of a saw wave. Okay, that's nice. It's a little bit bright. So first of all, I'm going to add a filter. So in this routing section here, I'm going to make sure that this sound source is going into filter 1. And then you can see that filter 1 is then feeding into FX1. Now that I've added that filter, you can hear that the sound is less bright. And we can control that brightness with the filter cutoff. Now is the time to make our first Airwave assignment. So I think what I want to do is I want to have air raise control the cutoff of that filter. So the first thing that I need to do is to make sure that I go to the dimension curves here, I find air raise and I click it so it's highlighted. This means it's ready to be assigned. Then I'm going to find the parameter I want to assign it to, in this case the filter cutoff, hover over this kind of ring on the outside of the knob, click and hold and drag in a direction to assign the modulation. So if I drag downwards, that will assign negative modulation, and if I drag upwards, positive. So now that I've done that, you can hear that my air raise movement is modulating that parameter. I'm going to set the default cutoff to a little bit lower so it's nice and soft. now I have this nice assignment for filter cutoff on air rate. Next, let's try giving some movement to the sound by using an envelope. So the process is very similar to how I assigned arrays. I'm going to go down into these envelopes here, click on the one that I want to assign so it's highlighted, and then I'm going to go to the parameter I want to assign it to and assign it. I'm going to show you an alternative method for assigning modulation, so you can click and drag on the outside of the knob, or with something highlighted, you can right-click a parameter, you can go into the drop-down here, and then you have a full list of all the things that are assignable. In this case, I want envelope 2 to control the coarse pitch, so I'm going to click there, click Add New Connection, and I'm going to set the amount of modulation that I want. So what I'm thinking is some pitch modulation, so the sound will start at a lower octave and then bend up to the correct octave. Now that I've done that, I can make sure that my tuning position is where I want it, so I'm going to drop it down by an octave because that envelope is going to push it up by an octave. We currently don't hear anything because the envelope is immediately triggering, but if I increase this attack value here, we get this nice swell. And so what I quite like to do when designing sounds that have this kind of element to them is to assign strike, so the velocity with which I hit the key, to the attack of that envelope, so that when I play harder, we get less of a rise, and when I play softer, we get more of that pitch rise. So to do that, I'm going to go back to the dimensions here, make sure that I'm on the keyboard section, and I'm going to click to highlight strike. Then I can drag downwards on this attack value so that the harder I strike, the less attack we have on that envelope, and therefore the faster that pitch rise is. That's a little bit too extreme. I'm just going to dial it back slightly. You can hear that now, after that initial rise has happened, it then starts to decay again, and that's because my sustain value is not set to 100%. So once the pitch reaches the maximum here, it then starts to decay a little again. So to fix that, I'm just going to make sure that my sustain is at 100%. Okay, so we've got two assignments set up. Now let's add a little bit more movement and link that to one of the air dimensions. What I'm thinking is I'm going to use an LFO to add some vibrato. So LFO just stands for low frequency oscillator, and it's essentially just this repeating cycle that we can then assign to a parameter to modulate it. So in this case, I'm going to use it for vibrato, so I'm going to assign it to the fine pitch of this first sound source. I'm going to click to make sure my LFO is highlighted, and just as before, go to the parameter and click to drag up the modulation I want. You can hear we have that kind of warbling effect. Now LFOs can have two different polarity modes. So currently we're in unipolar polarity, which means that the LFO is going to push that value up and back to zero, up and back to zero. But actually what I want is for it to go both above and below. So we go sharp and flat, sharp and flat. So I'm going to switch the polarity to bipolar, and you can see that on this knob here now, we can see that the modulation is being applied to both sides. However, I don't want that vibrato to always be there. I want to be able to control it. So for that, I'm going to assign it to one of the air dimensions, and I think tilt would work quite well for this. So to do this, I'm going to go back to the Airwave Dimensions tab here, highlight Air Tilt, and then I'm going to go down to the level control of this LFO. So that's controlling how much of this LFO is being sent to the parameter it's assigned to. If it's at 0, then there's no modulation on the parameter at all. And if it's at 100%, then the full amount's being applied. So I'm going to link Air Tilt to the amount of the LFO just by dragging up like that. And then as I turn my hand and apply Air Tilt, I'm increasing the amount of that LFO that's being sent, and therefore the amount of vibrato that's being applied. Next, I want to add a more kind of percussive or plucky sound on the keys so that I can kind of play rhythmically on the keys, but then have this nice synth swell that happens with the air dimensions. And for that, I'm going to use a new sound source, and I'm going to use a sampler. So I'm just going to click this icon to activate here, and I'm going to change to sampler mode. Quick little tip, this center section here will give you expanded information and controls for the sound source you're controlling. You can switch which has the focus here by just clicking on the different sound sources, and you'll see that that center view cycles depending on which one's selected. So we're going to go for our sample module, and I think just a nice kind of Rhodes keyboard sound would be cool. So I'm going to click the name here, and that's going to bring up the sample browser. I'm going to go into keys, and I'm going to select the Rhodes sustain sound. Now currently our sample module is also going through the filter that our first oscillator is going through. I don't want that, I want the kind of raw Rhodes sound without the filter. So I'm going to go into my routing tab here. I'm going to turn off the assignment for filter 1, and I'm going to send it straight into effects bus 1. So now we get that kind of raw Rhodes sound without it being processed by the filter. I want to add a little bit more interest, so I'm going to do a couple of things. So first of all, I'm going to repeat this kind of pitch decay that we had on the first oscillator. So I'm going to take it down by an octave. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to add an assignment for envelope 3 up for 12 semitones. And then I'm going to play with this attack value. I'm going to repeat what I did before, where strike will reduce the time it takes for that pitch rise to happen. So quite subtle, but just adding a little bit of movement and mimicking the movement that we have in the first oscillator. Then I'm going to get a bit more bite out of the sound when I play at harder velocities by adding a wave folder effect. So each sound source can have independent filters, which are accessed in this center view. So I'm going to go onto my sound source 2. I've turned on that filter, and I'm going to click this drop down here, and I'm going to select the wave folder. Then I'm going to make sure that I have strike selected, and I'm going to drag up on the drive and bias, and I'm going to drag down on the level, because as that kind of wave folding is added, it's going to boost our output. That's a little bit harsh, so I'm just going to back off some of that assignment. This is a good opportunity to show you how curves work. So we have this strike assignment, which is controlling the drive and the bias of this wave folder. And currently we have a linear curve, so a completely linear relationship with my strike and the value that's being sent out. But sometimes we don't want that, and that's where curves come in really handy. So what I can do is I can click and hold and drag up and down on this curve here. So if I have it like this, then as I apply strike, very quickly we'll start to reach high values of whatever it's assigned to. Whereas if I do something like this, then it's only my kind of strongest presses that are going to take this value to the maximum. So in this case, I'm just going to back it off slightly. So we get this kind of like softness at first, but then when I really dig into the keys, we get that extra grit. Okay, let's start adding some more textures. So I think I want some nice ambience to come in, and the air dimensions are really great for that. You can have a fairly dry kind of core sound, but then bring in these ambient textures with your gestures. So for this, I'm going to use another sampler module here. I'm going to go into the sample browser and find something that I like. So I know that there's a sound called alias source, which I made, which is a nice kind of cinematic texture. If you want to solo a module at any time so you can hear it without the other elements, then you can simply click this S icon in the top right of the UI. Okay, so we have this nice kind of texture. It's also currently going through the filter, which I don't want, so I'm going to send it straight into effects 2. And let's take a listen. So a nice atmospheric sound with loads of movement already in it. What I'm going to do though is I don't want this sound to always play. So this level control controls the output of this source. I'm going to take that down to 0. So you don't hear it at all when you're playing normally. And then I'm going to link one of the air dimensions to the level of this source. So let's say air glide. Just make sure it's highlighted as before. Click and drag up on this level control. Now I think what would be quite nice actually is if this layer comes in at an octave higher than the other sound sources. Yeah, that's nice. I'm going to add another sampler module and show you a nice feature, which is copy and paste. So if I right click and I click copy, I can go to any of the available sound sources, right click and either paste or paste with the mod assignments. So paste with mod assignments is useful because that air glide that we've already assigned to this source will then also be applied to where we paste it. Now I have the same thing here and I have the level being controlled by air glide. And I'm going to change this sample now to a string sample. I'm going to scroll through my samples until I find one. Let's do sustain soft. Have a listen in isolation. So I think what would be nice is if we drop that down to the normal octave. I'm just going to solo these. If you want to solo multiple things at the same time, just click Command and then click the solo icon. And I'm going to use the curves here to kind of have this two-stage relationship. So as I apply my air glide, I want the strings to come in quickly. And then as I reach the high end of that air glide, I want the other sample to then come in. So to do that, I'm going to right click on this assignment here. So this is the strings. And I'm going to bring this curve up so that as I start applying a little bit of air glide, that source comes in very quickly. And then I'm going to kind of do the opposite. On this one, I'm going to drag this down a little bit so that it takes more air glide to reach the same kind of level. So if we listen to those two now, you see those strings come in first. And then we get that higher layer when I reach the kind of extreme of air glide. Okay, now I think it needs a different layer on top, and this is a good opportunity to show you the Granular Engine. I'm going to click to enable this source here, and I'm going to switch to granular mode. And I really like doing granular stuff with kind of vocal samples. So I'm going to click, as before, the name here to open the sample browser. And I'm going to go down to vocal, and you can see there's these Marcus R, E, M sounds here, which I recorded for the factory library. So I'm going to choose the Marcus R sound, and I'll just solo that so you can hear how that sounds at default. So you can hear that there's this kind of rhythmic element to what's happening, and that's controlled by both the rate, the size, and the shape and tilt controls here. So if I go to a very small grain size, you'll hear that it gets more staccato. And then the rate controls how quickly those grains are repeating. And then the shape controls kind of it's like an envelope for those grains, essentially. If I change the shape to have more of a tilt, then rather triggering suddenly, we'll get this kind of smoother sound. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it quite staccato. And what I want is, as I apply air flex, for both that layer to come in and the rate of those grains to increase. So to do that, I'm going to find my kind of base value. That's going to be a very slow speed and a decent size. And then I'm going to go down here to air flex, highlight it, and then drag up on the rate and down slightly on the size. And then I'm just going to tweak those to taste. So I'm going to add just a little bit more speed. And make it slightly sharper by decreasing the size a little more. And then the final thing to do is to make sure that we only introduce that layer when we're applying air flex. So again, I'm going to drop down this level control and drag up to assign air flex to the level, which means that then I'll hear nothing at first, and then as I apply air flex, great. I'm actually going to start with a slightly smaller size as well and reduce the amount of modulation on that. Great, so now we've got 5 different sound sources. That's 5 different layers within our sound. We have envelopes assigned, we've got an LFO assigned, and we have assignments for a lot of the air dimensions. Let's add a few more now. So air grasp is usually used to control the volume. So one hand closed like this will give you a 50% reduction in volume. That will give you 100. So you can either kind of do these swells or you can do more choppy staccato effects. So to assign air grasp, it's really simple. I'm just going to click it here to make sure it's highlighted. I'm going to go into the routing tab, and then I'm just going to drag down on these outputs, which means that as I apply air grasp, those outputs will be decreased. Simple as that. You can obviously assign air grasp to whatever you want, but we find that it works nicely on volume, so I'm going to leave it there for now. Next, we have one more dimension to assign. That's our air slide. And a good thing to kind of bring this patch together and make everything mesh nicely is to add some effects. So to do that, I'm going to go into the Effects tab. And you can see that I've already set my configuration here to parallel. There's a few different available modes for how the effects section is configured. The default is mixed, which means that everything is kind of processed in series. If you send things to effects 1, then they will be affected by these and everything after them. If you send something to effects 2, then they won't be affected by these, but everything is still kind of summed into the same output. I like to use the parallel configuration for Airwave sounds because very often I want kind of different effects for the keyboard sound versus the dimensions that are introduced in the air. So I've set to parallel here, and then my routing tab will control which of my elements go to which of those chains. So I want my roads to go into effects 1, and then I want all of my kind of other atmospheric layers to go into effects 2. And then for our wavetable module here, you can see that it's going into filter 1 here, but then the output of filter 1 is going into effects 1, and we can change that if we need to. So I'm going to go back into my effects tab, and I'm just going to add some reverb for the very dry kind of core sound. I'm going to choose this big reverb. Let's take a listen. So I can just play with these controls to achieve the kind of sound that I want. So I'm going to add a bit more stereo width, a bit more density, and a tiny bit more decay. And let's also add some reverb for the kind of atmospheric airwave dimensions. And I'm going to have larger decay and density values here to give a bit more of a sense of space. Full stereo width, a bit more density. So I'm finding that the vocal stuff is getting a little bit drowned out. So there's a few things I can do to kind of try and make it more prominent. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go into this first oscillator. I'm going to go to the ring mod section and have source 5 be my input. And then I'm also going to add a tiny bit of FM modulation from source 5, so that as those grains are kind of being choppy and doing their rhythmic thing, they're also going to impact the wavetable module as well. Now it's a little bit too much, so I'm going to back it off just a little. So what I'm also going to do, we're still kind of losing those choppy rhythmic elements. So when I'm applying Airflex, I'm going to back off this filter that is being opened by air rays. I'm also going to go into the filter section here and just use the drive control. So I'm going to open the filter cutoff, but I'm just going to use drive to get a little bit more output from this layer. I have a linear relationship with Airflex and the volume of this, but because we have that kind of choppiness, I want the level to come in quicker. So I'm going to push this up a little. I'm going to drop my grain size down a little. Okay, it's coming together now. I think what I want to do is just add my last Airwave assignment. So that is for Air Slide. And I'm going to use that for a bit more of a twinkly layer on the air dimensions using a grain delay. So I'm going to go into my effects selector here, select grain delay. If I isolate one of these layers and go back, you can hear it adds that kind of twinkly tail, which is an octave above. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a control for the wet value of that effect to Air Slide. So as I apply slide, then I push up the wet level of that effect. So I've got all my Airwave assignments done. I think what I also want to do is add a little bit more control from the keyboard itself by assigning press. And so to do that, I'm going to go make sure that press is highlighted. I'm going to open this cutoff that's controlling oscillator 1 when I apply pressure. So I'm just going to drag upwards on here a little. So I still have it assigned to air raise, but I also get this kind of on-key action. Something that's also worth noting is that we actually have these assignable on and off lag controls for each of the dimensions. And these are really useful, especially for the Airwave dimensions, because sometimes you have to suddenly bring your hand out of the air in order to get back to the keys that you're playing, if you need to keep up with the bar or the tempo of what you're playing. And sometimes if you don't have any lag assigned, that can result in this kind of cut as you suddenly lose those dimensions that you're applying. And so a good way to get around this is using the on and off lags. So these sliders on the left and right of each dimension control the onset lag on this side and the offset on this side. So when these are set to 0, there's no lag, so it's kind of directly tied to your movements. But with air glide here, what I want is as I stop applying air glide, for that value to reduce slowly rather than suddenly. So I can push this up slightly. And if I isolate just the strings here, and I set this to quite an extreme value, you can see it takes a long time for those strings to die down even after I stop applying air glide. I want a more subtle value about here. Nice, so we get a kind of more natural sounding decay on the sound, even when the dimension is no longer being applied. And you can apply this technique to any of the air dimensions and also to some of the touch ones. One last section to touch on is this macro section here. So these are kind of performance tools that allow you 5 different knobs that can tweak the sound in different ways. If you're using a C board, these are controlled by the faders and the XY pad on the left of the instrument, or you can just assign them to another MIDI CC or click and drag them with your mouse. To assign them, I'm just going to, again, click on something to make sure it's highlighted. And I'm going to go into my effects tab because I quite like to have a control of the amount of reverb that's being applied. So I'm going to set my kind of minimum reverb amounts here. And let's drag that decay down. And then I have macro 3 selected, and I'm going to click and drag up on the decay and wet here. So then as I move this knob, I'm increasing those amounts. Then I can double click here and I can rename this for my ease. So I can say reverb, click enter, and then I have this nice controllable thing that can be mapped to multiple different sources. The only thing that remains to do now is just to save our patch so we can recall it later. To do that, I'm going to go up here and I'm going to click save as. I'm going to give it a name. So I'm just going to say Airwave Demo. And we can also choose different tags on the side here to help you keep your presets organized. So this was a kind of hybrid sound because we have both sampled and wavetable elements. It's pretty synthy, but it's got some strings. So let's say just synth for now. And then you can also do different articulation styles and timbres as well, just to help you keep all your presets organized. Next, I can just click Save As, and that preset is fully saved for me to recall later. One other thing to show you is this mod matrix view. So this is kind of the default view, but if I want to see all the modulations that I've set up for a sound in one place, I can just click here on the mod matrix, and this shows me all of those assignments that I've made in this video so far. And it's a nice way of tweaking multiple assignments at the same time if you want to balance the levels of things together. I hope you found this video useful. It wasn't intended to be a really deep dive into Equator 2. There's a lot to discover, so check out some of our other resources for that. But hopefully it's given you some ideas on how you can start to build your own Airwave sounds. If you want to connect with other music makers and share some of the sounds that you're making, you can join our Discord. There's a link in the description below. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.